right, here we go. Hello, everybody. I'm Ben from Puremix.net, and we are here today for STEM Mastering with the one, the only, Mike Wells. How you doing today, Mike?
I'm good.
Nice. So Mike is joining us live via internet, satellite, live stream connection all the way from LA. I'm obviously here today at Flux Studios in New York City. So Mike, we've got a three-part series that you did with Dangerous Music that you guys put together,
Yeah.
all about STEM mastering. That's gonna walk us through what the STEM mastering process is, just in general, what the topic of STEM mastering is all about, and then the third part, which is probably the coolest part, is where you actually take us through the entire STEM mastering process with a musical example, showing us like the before and after difference that STEM mastering can have. So I'm really excited. I've already watched all the videos. I've made a bunch of notes, got a lot of questions. But as the audience will
Cool.
notice, we also have a live chat going. So if you guys out in the world there have questions for Mike, feel free to pop them in there in the live chat, and we'll do our best to get to them. But we're here today to share information with you guys and to really kind of inform and educate. You know, STEM mastering is this kind of weird in between, it's somewhere in between mastering and mixing, and some people get really confused about how it is or why people should consider using STEM mastering. So we're gonna get through all of that kind of stuff today. But to start off, Mike, tell us a little bit about yourself, man. How'd you get into mastering? What projects have you worked on, and why should we be listening to you when it comes to STEM mastering?
Sure. Well, let's see. As far as getting into mastering, I came into it by way of mixing, which I came to it by way of recording, and before that, being a musician. So my first recording was like a desktop two-track cassette deck, and just recording the bands I was in. And then I got a Fostex 4-track, the 160, if you remember that, the black tabletop one. That was fun. Made
Yep.
demos for my bands and other bands in town. I was having a good time. Then we started, going to studios and doing actual recordings. Moved out to San Francisco from Kansas, where I grew up. Was in the thrash metal, death metal, speed metal scene in SF, which was awesome. It was a dream come true. Was on Metal Blade for a couple records. Just had a blast doing that stuff. But going into recording studios, seeing professional recording, watching the whole process happen, was very interesting. Worked with a bunch of people. There were great Bay Area engineers, Mark Sinisak, for instance. And so getting into all that, the thing that stuck out to me the most, that was the most interesting, was this mastering thing. We're talking early 90s up to mid 90s, where things were changing in a big way. The CD had been around for a while. DAT was like the primary delivery system at the time. Things were very slow and very unstable is the word I would use in the mastering world back then. And the folks that were driving that service, I can't say were the friendliest people that I experienced. And so I would go to mastering sessions and I would ask questions and I would just get shut down, like, get the firm hand, like, shut up, I know what I'm doing. And it was never even that. But the number one thing that irked me about mastering sessions was actually wanting to ask about the audio result. Like, hey, I have some concerns about the mix, and can we talk about how mastering might address that? No one ever wanted to have that conversation. So that actually got me, more than anything, that got me interested in mastering from the standpoint
Yeah.
of like, well, what's this all about? And
Made
the
you
further I
curious.
got into it, yeah, exactly. I'm kind of a bullheaded guy. It's like, well, you're going to shut me down, then I need to figure out what's going on. So I just started getting more interested in it. And the more interested I became in it, the more I realized, wow, I really enjoy this topic. And really, this is like a fascinating idea. It does have a lot of mystery around it. There are a lot of no rules boundaries to it, but there also are a lot of rules, like anything in audio. So
Mm-hmm.
the further I got my nose into it, the more I thought, like, wow, this is really where I want to be as far as a career goes. So I started up my own shop in '99. I started doing mastering for other artists, and I started Michael's Mastering right around 2001. And I've been doing it ever since. I was in San Francisco up until I just started year 5 here in LA. And so, yeah, it's just been going strong for a long time. And even in the 17 years I've been doing it, we've seen a lot of change in the industry and a lot of change in how mastering works. And specifically to answer your question, finishing answering your question, STEM mastering has become more of a question that clients are asking me. Is it possible that you could do this? And if so, how would we go about it? So I think we've seen the topic come and go a few times in the last 10, 15 years. I want to say this is the third time it's really coming back around in a big way. In big way, I mean myself and Dangerous Music really trying to make a big push and showcase it as a topic. But yeah, I can say it, when I've seen it come around in the past, it has been a big question. Like, well, how would you not end up screwing that up? It is, I think that's the number one criticism. How is that not mixing? And how are you going to totally not destroy the mix? I think those are valid questions. And I've spent a lot of time developing a process that works for me and a process that works for my clients. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So I know that was a long-winded answer, but I hope that answered your question.
You nailed it. Absolutely. Well, so, I mean, obviously the next obvious question is, what is STEM mastering? And instead of you having to explain it to us live, you've already made the video that explains this. And so let's roll the video. It's going to talk about what STEM mastering is, and then we're going to come back from the video and kind of dive a little bit deeper, fill in the blanks, and get some more info out of you. So here we go. Here's the first video.
Hello, everyone. Mike Wells here in Los Angeles, California. We're here today to talk about a very powerful yet misunderstood topic called STEM mastering. We have a lot to cover, so we've put this into 3 videos. This video, STEM Mastering Overview, we go through the what and why around STEM mastering. Video 2, the STEM mastering process, we go through the how STEM mastering works. And in video 3, STEM Mastering Applied, we go through a real-world example for a track that I've done with the STEM mastering process. The term stems came from the broadcast industry, and what it represents is a group of instruments mixed together to create a stereo submix. For instance, let's say you're doing a rock track and you have drums, bass, guitars, and vocals. You can take all of the drum microphones and mix those down into a submix, one stereo file, and call it drums. That would be your drum stem. You could then take all of the electric guitars within that track and mix those down into one stereo file. That is your guitar stem. Same with the bass, same with the vocals. Now you end up with 4 stereo stems. So your mix has been broken down from a stereo mix into 4 stems that when you play all of those stems together, you get the stereo mix. Think of it this way. Through the mastering process, you're going to be doing a few functions: compression, limiting, EQ. You're going to be taking a mix from its dynamic range of the mix level to a reduced dynamic range of a commercial gain mastered level. So when you get a mix, for instance, strap a limiter across it, crank it up to today's commercial gain requirements. By doing so, you're going to hear a number of things. You're going to hear where certain frequencies build up and start to collide and cloud the mix and cause problems. You're going to hear some instruments might be farther background in the mix, and when you crank it up with compression and limiting, they may move too far forward where you don't like their position anymore, or the artist or the mixer doesn't like the position anymore. These kinds of things can change and move around when you're doing a lot of heavy lifting in the mastering process to achieve commercial gain. So by doing this analysis up front, by checking out a mix and cranking it up, you can uncover these things, like the things you want to preserve in the mix, the things you want to address in the mix through the mastering process. And with this analysis, you can determine if the track is a good candidate for STEM mastering. In the stereo mastering world, there is a phrase: you got to give something to get something. Those gives, those trade-offs are loss of transient attack, loss of punch, loss of power, loss of detail, shifting of instrument positions, frequency buildup. Those things you give. What are you getting? Loudness. If we look at the STEM mastering process, we are presented with an opportunity to make space at the stem level so that when we do stereo processing such as compression, EQ, limiting, we are not making the same trade-offs. We are giving up nothing and we are getting everything. Let's move on into video 2 and talk about how the STEM.
Whoa, all right, there we go. Nope.
Yeah.
Playback. All right. So that's the whole STEM mastering idea, the essence of what goes into STEM mastering. So, instantly the first question I have is, how often do you run into a mix where someone sends you that stereo file and you hear it and you're like, this is going to do better if I have access to the stems and can stem master this?
How often? I can actually answer that question better by talking about the types of genres or the types of industries where this most applies to.
Yeah.
For instance, I do a lot of work in the production music world, music for film, television, web commercials, that kind of stuff. And those guys work exclusively in stems. So in that situation, we are mastering from stems and we're developing different stereo outputs from that. And that's a lot of where I started looking at this from an analog way, how to do this with an analog process. Looking outside of the production music world, electronic music, those are the artists that really started coming to me because they're all really in the box, but they all want some analog flavor happening. And they're hearing stuff from deadmau5, from Skrillex, etc. And they're hearing these results that they're not able to achieve themselves. And they're hearing about the concept of stems from guess who? From deadmau5, from Skrillex. And so they're asking me about it. Is this something you can do? And so that's where I started looking at it for electronic music. And then as I started doing it for those guys, again, we're doing this hybrid situation where they're doing a lot of digital work. I'm doing a lot of analog work. And then some of these rock projects are coming up. And we're typically dealing with some of these issues that we'll talk about in the next two videos, where we have these blooming frequencies. And we're trying to do a lot of compensation for that in the stereo mastering world. And as I've been working more in production music and this style of technique with electronic music, the more I realized a lot of this stuff, well, a lot of it, meaning it's an agreement amongst the entire production team. But some of these issues that we're trying to solve in a stereo mastering world, wow, we could really tackle this even better in a STEM world. So if I feel like it's going to happen in a way where this could really benefit from it, I raise the question to the production team and, we start to talk about it. But obviously it's a sensitive topic. So who you're working with, how you're going to bring it up, what are really the things you're trying to address, that's all part of navigating this conversation and how you're going to go about it.
Yeah, so I mean, let's talk about that because the ego of mixers or the ego of the producers. That's basically what you're running up against a lot of times, right? Is this is their baby. They feel like the mix is perfect, and then here comes their mastering engineer saying like, it's good, and I can definitely make this sound better, but hey, I've got this stem mastering process that if you deliver me, a couple of stems, I could give you an even better result. How does that conversation usually go for you?
It's a sensitive conversation. Just that's the easiest way to put it. It's obviously you got to feel it out project by project, and I'll even divide that into two different types. Meaning, I could easily say, and we all experience this as mastering engineers, there is an entire camp of the half a dB thing. But you hear that in magazines talking about a half a dB of EQ or a half a dB of compression or et cetera, et cetera. And sure, there's that half a dB, but you know what there also is? There's the half a dB of limiting, meaning you get a mix from a mixer and it is done, and what are they looking for? They're looking for QA/QC, metadata, ISRC, proper file formatting, that kind of stuff. So when you're in that type of function, you're being hired to be a traditional mastering engineer, which is the QA/QC engineer, file format conversion, all that kind of stuff. So if I get a project and I get mixes like that, okay, I'm not even going to entertain this topic, even though hearing it, maybe I think it would benefit from it, but I'm receiving stuff where it's like, okay, I see what my role is here. The flip side of that is you're navigating the conversation with the people you're talking to. You can feel, you can get a sense for how people feel about the project, how attached to it they are. If the mixer's not involved in the conversation when you first get the artist and the producer involved, then bringing the mixer into the conversation can also help you understand, what's the emotional playing field here? How are people reacting to the work that I've been given? Because if I'm sensing a certain type of emotional reaction, maybe it's not even worth having the conversation. But especially if it's people that I work with all the time, it's easy for me to have the conversation. If it's someone I haven't worked with, like these guys, Hard Youth are a great example. I hadn't worked with this band before. They brought the thing in. They were giving me reference masters and saying, this is what we're looking for against the mixes that they gave me. And I said, hey, you know what, guys? here's this opportunity to do this. And they wanted to try it out. And once we tried it out, they loved it and we went forward with it. So it's a per basis kind of deal. And
Yeah.
I really think your emotional radar plays a big part in navigating the desire to open up that door.
Yeah. You gotta have these like engineer, producer, soft skills, and be able to have some emotional intelligence about how am I fitting in, how are these people feeling in general about what's going on here. So does stem mastering, does it end up meaning less revisions? Does it make the process actually faster for you as a mastering engineer, or does it actually add more to the whole process?
It takes longer. It definitely takes longer. Revisions, depending on what needs to be changed, can take longer. I do, it's an analog rig, so I have a spreadsheet that I track all the settings in. I do write everything down, and it's a system I've developed over a long time, right? So I can recall the entire configuration. I can recall, the calibration. Everything could be recalled. It's all running through a custom patch bay. It's an XLR patch bay. We can do everything that we want to do. But there's time involved to do all of that recall. In a STEMS situation, there's even more time involved to do that recall. So when I'm working on a STEMS project, I prefer to have people available, to review a track that we're working on and move on from that before we move forward. Because it'll take a half a day to a whole day to do a STEM master, whereas you can do a stereo master in an hour and a half, right? So it's a far more involved process than doing a stereo thing.
And so I assume also it costs a little bit more as well. How do you kind of gauge what you're charging your clients when you move from stereo mastering to stem mastering?
Yeah, it's I will say that is a work in progress. I've tried flat fees, I've tried per stem fees, I've tried hourly fees, and then I go back to just a stem fee. So it's because it's a very uncharted territory. It is kind of feeling it out and trying to see how it goes. I can say as I move forward into a project, we can usually find a goal price. We'll start it out in a certain way, and then we'll kind of see how it's going, and then we'll find a place to go from there. And again, if someone's willing to entertain the idea and we're going into that process, they're also willing to be open-minded to how the process works and the results that they're looking for. So no one's being forced into this process. I can definitely say that. And I'm not beating a drum saying this is the only way to go. This is an option, just like using tape or digital is an option. So it's important to remember that this is a tool in the toolkit. As far as, one question I get a lot, and I think this is a very valid question. So if stem mastering is more expensive, then why would I even try it? So my way of resolving that is, again, if I feel like the project is going to benefit from stems, then I will approach, the situation to see if they're interested. And if it turns out that they're interested, then I will say, okay, let's do one song with stereo and we'll do one song with stems, the same song. And if you're not digging the stem route, I will charge you the stereo rate and we'll move forward. If you're digging the stem route, then we'll charge the stem rate and we'll move forward. So it's a win-win for the client.
Yeah.
And that way they're not taking a financial risk where they might, wow, I regret it later, even if it's only that one song. So in a way you could say I'm eating the cost, but I'm wanting to go down that road because I'm believing that this is the best solution for this record. And again, if they're willing to look down that road, they're engaging in the process. They're not confrontational or judgmental about the process, which is, I think, what we've seen a lot of on Facebook in the last day.
Yeah, that's true. So this kind of brings us to the next logical point, which is, what does this stem mastering process actually look like? And once again, conveniently, we have a whole video where you explain what the stem mastering process looks like. So let's cut to that.
Mike Wells here. Let's jump into video 2, the stems mastering process. In this video, we're going to cover receiving the stems from your engineer, working with your mixer to get the files that you need, the tools and workflow that you'll need to do the stems processing, and the tools and workflow that you'll need to do the stereo processing. We're ready to receive stems, And how I recommend going about this is you want to work with the engineer, discuss the project that you're working on, and determine with him or her how you're going to break this down into separate elements or what stems you're going to create. In our prior video, we talked about a rock example, just a regular rock band. So let's stick with that for now. And this is the example I'll be using in video 3 as well. So here the engineer and I have decided to go down to 4 stems: guitars, bass, drums, vocals. So what I request from the engineer is go into the DAW and mute any processing that is at the master bus level, a compressor, limiter, EQ, etc. Mute that stuff, turn it off. Then go down to the drums. Any effects that are happening at the drum bus level, reverb, delay, you name it, leave those on, render that out, all of the drums, as the one stereo stem. Repeat that process for the other elements, guitars, bass, and vocals. So now I'm left with 4 stereo stems, and when I play them back all together, they should sum and give me the mix. I also ask for the mix itself as one stereo file, and if there is master bus processing there, compressor, limiter, EQ, I want that on the mix, because that becomes my reference. When I'm listening to the stems playback against the mix reference, I can hear the difference of the raw mix without the master bus processing and the mix with the master bus processing that the engineer was doing on their end. That's very handy because it gives me an outline of where they were going with their master bus processing, which is in a way mastering, because mastering is 2-bus processing, but it also helps me understand the difference of where they were at the mix level pre-master bus and where I'm at moving forward into the mastering process. If you find that when you're playing back the stems that things go over 0 dBFS, you want to go back to your engineer and have a little chat with him or her about what's happening and figure that out, because when you play it back on your end, nothing should be going over 0. So now that you have the stems, you've got everything loaded up, let's move next into the tools and workflow that you're going to need for handling the stems processing. All right, you have your stems from your mixer, everything's loaded up in your DAW, you've got a multi-channel audio interface, set up an output for each stem in your DAW to route out to your DA converter. Now, let's start talking about workflow. Now we're getting into the analog domain. First thing you're going to hit is your digital to analog converter, one stereo channel for each stem. At this point, think about what you're going to be doing. The way I look at stem mastering is the same way I look at stereo mastering. I want the processors that I'm using to apply the color and the function that I want them to do. So if I want color, I want it to be at the compressor level or at the EQ level. I don't want it to be at the conversion level. What I want out of a converter is transparency, musicality, imaging. I want it to complement the music, but I don't want it to get in the way of the decisions that I want to make. I chose the Convert 8s because that's what I found them to be. Musical, definitive, full of detail. From there, I can then move out into the analog domain and leverage the color of the boxes that I have to do the function that I want them to do. So if I'm leveraging, for instance, in this example, we're doing a 4-stem project with guitar, bass, drums, and vocals. I'm thinking a great place for guitars to go is to my custom API 550 M's. Transformers are amazing. It's going to give some weight to those guitars, but I don't want anything from a conversion end getting in the way of the color I could get out of that API. You can apply that downstream well. Let the converter do the conversion and complement the music and that process of conversion as much as possible, but don't get in the way of the process that you're doing at the function level. So now we're able to take a look at what we might do at the stem level, and then we will now take it to the stereo level. For me, the summing mixer that I chose to go with was the 2-Bus Plus from Dangerous. I love the musicality, similar to the converters, very transparent in a musical way. But one of the things I love about this piece is that it does have a few color controls on it. So I can assign them at the stem level, or I can assign them at the stereo level once I've done the summing operation. Once we're at that sum stage and now I've got a stereo mix, now you want to take it into whatever stereo processing you're doing at that point and then capture it back in as your finished master. Taking a step back and looking at this whole process real quick, we're leveraging small changes at the stem level, EQ, compression, limiting, etc., to make space for these elements that are going to build up and cause problems when we get to the stereo mastering level. So by doing this work at the stem level, summing it to stereo, by the time I'm getting to that stereo processing, I'm doing very little. And we're going to show you that in video 3 when we move on to a real example.
Nice. So, Mike, how did you develop this whole stem mastering process? Was this something that kind of built up piece by piece, or did you? Walk us through how you've gotten into doing stem mastering the way you're currently doing it.
Sure. Again, it really started two ways. It started from requests from artists, and it also started as requests from production music clients, excuse me. And at the time it was like, well, how am I going to do that with the rig that I have? Because the rig that I have is a stereo analog rig, right? And the second question is, well, how am I not going to screw up the mix? I was a mixer before I was a mastering engineer, and hey, man, I don't want you messing with my mix. I get that argument.
Yeah.
And dear Facebook, I get the point, man. Settle down. So, looking at how I'm going to do this, it's like, well, I'm going to need a multi-channel converter. How am I going to deal with the patch bay, et cetera, et cetera? I also want to sum it down. The cool thing about the 2-bus plus is I can mult off. So I can get all of my stem outputs and sum it to stereo and send that out at the same time. There's not another summing mixer that'll do that, man. That's badass. So that thing really kind of gave me the idea of how I can do the stem processing, route the individual stems back into my DAW, capture those individual stems. I can also sum it and then put that back in and get my stereo result. Coming back to your revision standpoint, since I'm capturing all the stems, if we want to do revisions, maybe I can do that there, send it back out, sum it again to a stereo, and then capture that back in as the revision. Then I'm not recalling the whole thing. Sometimes I can do that, and the revision is very easy. And right there, I'm just kind of pointing out a couple of workflow issues, and there's been a lot of time going into how am I going to set this rig up? How am I going to make this time efficient? How am I going to make this process effective? I've been working on this process for about 1.5 years, and the number one thing outside of technically how to make it work is how am I going to create a process where I'm going to honor what the artist, producer, and yes, mixing engineer want to have happen in this process so that everybody's getting what they want out of it. And it was creating the idea of mastering the stereo mix first and getting that signed off by all parties, because that creates the target. And when we have the target, we're not worried about remixing. What we're concerned with now is creating the solution that avoids the compromises that we encountered in the stereo master.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I assume, mastering engineers, you guys all talk to each other. Is your stem mastering process, is it basically the same as other mastering engineers, or have you heard of people kind of doing this differently than how you approach it?
I haven't actually talked to anybody since I've started doing this thing. I mean, this thing's pretty elaborate,
Yeah, it is.
I can't say I know anybody else doing the analog stem thing in the way that I'm doing it. There was a guy about 10 years ago and there was a piece of equipment on the market. It was one of those like turnkey mastering solution kind of deals. And it also supported like 4 stems. And I remember he came and went. He was an LA guy. I don't know if he's still around, but that was, like I said, it was one of the times I saw it come around. One of the things I will say that's important to like just quickly note is every mastering engineer works with stems. Again, dear Facebook, every mastering engineer works with stems. And you know why? We all get a instrumental and a vocal from every single rap artist I work with. I get an instrumental and I get a vocal because they want the instrumental printed, and they also want you to use your judgment on where to place the vocal. They want an a cappella. So I'm always, every time, Facebook, every time, I get 2 stems for every hip hop track, and we do a stem mastering with hip hop tracks. So, I saw a couple of mastering engineers weigh in on that Facebook thread yesterday, and they were also saying, I get stems all the time, and we're summing those to stereo. So I think it's a lot more common than people want to talk about. I think what people don't talk about is processing the stems individually. But at the same time, if we're getting a vocal and a music stem, you are making changes to each stem to have them fit together.
Yeah. And so what's the most amount of stems that you've ever received?
There is a production music library company that wants to do 16 stereo pairs. And to give you all some clarity about this whole production music market. So like I said, that market works in stems. Because let's say you're Sony Pictures and you're looking at the world of production music because you're making a trailer for this new movie and you need some of the strings and explosions and build up risers so that the guy can say "in a world" over the top of it, right? And they're out there looking for stuff, and a lot of the times they're hearing a stereo mix, but they're also hearing all the elements in that stereo mix. So they may come back to the production music company and say, we would love to have the explosions and the strings, but we don't want the horns and the risers. So that's a situation where the production and music company has to provide the stems. Yeah. So in their situation, they have they have masters of the stereo mixes, but they don't have masters of the stems. So again, the process I've created in a lot of ways was started for their market, and it's moved over into the music market. But that way I'm giving them, mastered stems for their product as well as stereo masters for their product. But for music, I try to keep it to 4 because I think 4 is a really good upper limit for music. There are some artists I've gone to with 8, and I think 8 is a pretty big boundary. 6 is a good compromise if they really want to go bigger. And then in the library world, it's usually between 12 and 16.
Yeah. So, and something that I run into a lot is typically when I'm printing stems for artists, it's going to be for like their live show or to make, alt mixes later on. So when you're finished with your stem mastering process, do you actually print the mastered version of those stems so that the artists have those for, say, their live shows?
I have them, and some people ask for them and other people don't, but they are available. So anybody that wants them, yes, absolutely. Like I said, I molt everything off through the 2-Bus Plus, so I capture all the stems individually. And so, they're all printed. Yeah. So I have both.
Nice. And then it falls on you to be, preparing the instrumental, the TV track, the acapella, kind of delivering all of those final alt mixes that the labels want, right?
Yes. Yes.
Nice.
And one of the nice things about the stem process, real quickly, just to the point you just mentioned, is again, let's look at a hip hop record, for instance, right? Typically, they've got the bass line, they've got the drums, there's some kind of synth thingy happening on top of it, and then some vocals, right? And that's a typical hip hop rap song, right? And so if they give me the stems, I can output any version that they want. If they give me alt mixes, I've got 5 different stereo alt mixes. They call me back 2 weeks later. Oh, dude, we need this other alt mix. We forgot to give it to you. Here it is. I'm recalling everything. I'm pulling it all back up and that kind of stuff. The nice thing about this process is because I'm capturing all the stems back, they could call me a week later and say, oh, you know what? We need this other alt. Cool, dude. Pull it up, export, done. I'm not even charging them for it. So because it's been made so easy on my end to do that export, it's no problem. I don't have to recall. I don't have to master a new version. I don't have to charge them more money. I can just do it very simply. So it's, again, it was really fascinating seeing the amount of negativity yesterday on that Facebook thread. I hate to keep coming back to it, but it's fascinating to see the amount of negativity because it's so focused on the hypercriticism of you're remixing my mix. And you know what? That's a very valid concern. But can we take that concern and say we all recognize it and start looking at the other possibilities that open up from this? Those are very valid concerns, and they're important concerns, and they should be taken into consideration.
And what ultimately matters is the end result, which what I loved about how you talked about your process is that you start from the stereo, start from the mix that they love, master it. Make sure you have a starting point that everybody agrees on. This is good. This is my mix and your master. And then you say to them, hey, let's try to make this better. It's not always gonna win. It doesn't have to win, but let's at least give it a shot. And a big question, even here on the chat so far is when it comes to like 2-bus compressors. So I believe you mentioned there, you asked to take everything off of the 2-bus, all the compressors, all the EQs. Does that really, if say they leave them on, does that affect what you can do in there? Because like say a SSL compressor, if they're smacking it, it's going to change the tone of the drums that you get delivered as those stems. So then you're almost having to work to recreate that sound, or it may, kind of start leaning everything to a different direction. does that just make more work for you to recreate what they already had, as opposed to having them go ahead and print through that stuff and maybe deliver stuff that level wise isn't perfectly matching up when you combine the stems, but it at least has the tone that they had imagined?
Great question. The coolest part about answering this question is, well, I've been doing this for a long time, and I've been a musician since I was 5. So it's not that out of the realm of possibility for me to understand how to get that. And in the world of mastering, I got a big rig. I got a lot of tools. As I always say, I find that there's 2 types of mastering engineers. There's my sound guys and there's your record guys. The my sound guys typically have a very small rig, and you're hiring me for my sound. I do my thing. Everything goes through one path. The signal doesn't change. The settings don't really change. It's my thing. That's why you're hiring me. I don't like that idea because it's not your record. It's the artist's record. But you know what? I'm not going to tell these guys how to run their business. There's also the flip side of that is the your record type of mastering engineer. And that's the camp that I fall into. And what the your record guys do is you're hiring me to master your record. So what is it that you want to accomplish out of the mastering process? And I have a variety of tools to reach different results that can allow the artist to reach their vision, not my vision. So to go back to your question, someone's got an SSL compressor on the bus. Okay, cool. I've got an Allen Smart C2 and plenty of EQs. So if I need to kind of get that drum change where it's happening, I can do it. And I love to get the version with the master bus processing. If I'm doing stereo mastering, I ask them to take that stuff off because I can make that sound happen in the stereo mastering world. And then I'm not putting a compressor on top of a compressor, which is always a bad idea. So, but again, some guys, they want to have it on there and it's there, it's like, hey man, this is my mix. I don't want you messing with it. You know what the answer that I have to that is? Cool. All right, let's find a way to get you where you want to go and we'll do it. But again, coming back to your question, in the analog domain with the amount of options I have, coming out of the Convert 8s, routing this thing wherever I want it to go, having the stereo mix with the bus mastering processing on it, I can hear where we want to go with different things. Yes, one compressor with a lot of flavor like an API 2500 or especially the SSL, it's affecting everything on the mix. But again, maybe the artist didn't want it to affect the guitars, but it's going to affect the guitars because it's on the the mix bus, but they love what it did to the drums. That is an opportunity to use this to the to the advantage of the results. So, but in my world, I think my preference is to have a mix without master bus processing on it. And if they want to put it on there for a reference for me, we can match that. We can always match that, and we can go above and beyond it as well. But the guys that want to leave it on there and they're like, hey man, I don't want to take it off. Again, my answer is cool. We'll make it work.
Yeah. Man, Mike, you're so flexible. Like everyone thinks that it is a hard and fast rule that it has to be done this way or else the whole point here is that the end result, end of the day, the final master, what you are finally putting out, uploading to iTunes, putting on Spotify, playing on the radio, like that's the thing that ultimately matters, that everybody agrees. This sounds good. How you get there doesn't matter whatsoever.
Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah,
absolutely. Either way, no matter whatever drive you take, as long as you're getting to the right destination that everybody agrees on and enjoys, it's good. So
right.
The question I have here is, obviously you love analog. You've got an amazing analog rig. Do you also use in the box tools as part of your process?
I do. I use plugins for corrective processing when I can't achieve those results in the analog domain. So for instance, dynamic EQ, I like dynamic EQ a lot more than I like multiband compression. But at the same time, I've got a TubeTech SMC2B, tube multiband compressor, right? It's one of my favorite de-essers, and it's great for Americana and folk music and anything that's like a light acoustic kind of thing. So if I need to do some multiband, that's the right choice for that genre. But if I'm doing, a black metal record, it's not going through the TubeTech SMC, and if I need to do some de-essing on this vocal for the black metal record, I'm not going to do it with a tube compressor. That's where like the Brainworks dynamic EQ is really great, right? So my my go-to is the analog domain, because those tools give the character and the flavor and the space and the imaging that we just can't duplicate in the box. And quite frankly, it's never going to get duplicated. They can't make a robot a real human being. So I'm sorry, you can't make a plug-in a real piece of analog hardware. But if I can't solve the problem in the analog domain, I will make a hybrid situation. I will use a plug-in before going to analog to do what I can't do in analog. And then I'll still use the box downstream after conversion to do what I want to do, but that situation has been corrected before I get to the analog domain.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. So, got feedback here coming in here on the live stream. Why is a compressor after a compressor always a bad idea?
You're never going to get the time constants to agree.
So it's going to be the attack and release are going to be fighting with each other, or are you losing transients? What is it about the time constants that, because
both for one. Yeah. No, go ahead, Ben. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, because I definitely offend all the time. Like my typical 2-bus chain, I start with like a Varimute, and then I have an EQ, and then I go out to an SSL compressor, back into a Pico compressor. So I'm using 3 different compressors in series with each other, all to do slightly different things. And, half dB here, 1 dB here, and, using wet dry. So, I already offend and do this, but that's kind of, I've gotten used to that sound. What is it about the time constants battling each other that doesn't work with your ear?
Okay, cool. Well, first off, I think your answer is a great reply to what we just said a minute ago, which is, A, there's no rules, and there's no right way to do things. It's like, what's working for the record? What's working for you to get the results that the artist wants? Awesome answer. And hey, man, like you said, it's working for you. The way I look at it is, you're never going to get the time constants to agree. But I will say, I put the Varimute before the dangerous compressor all the time. Or I'll put the Varimute after the dangerous compressor all the time. But one of those guys is not doing gain reduction. I'm using the Varimute for flavor. It's just where I'm putting it. That happens all the time. Or I use the Allen Smart C2 to get the EQ out of it, but I'm not using it as a compressor. I'll use the dangerous compressor as a compressor, right? So that's where you're leveraging one box to do function, and you're leveraging another box to do flavor. And so, I'll stack boxes in any kind of way to get the result I'm looking for, because, again, in the analog world, I've got different tools for flavor and function, but a lot of it's for flavor. So coming back to your question, if I'm on, a stereo situation and 2 compressors stacked together, I'm making a sacrifice somewhere there that I usually don't like to hear. One of them's going to alter the transients. One of them's trying to tackle the meat. And so you can make one slow and one fast, but I guess to my ears, I'm always fighting with, what I'm hearing for attack and release times. Now, if we're in the stem world, then I am adding, multi-compressors, just like we would be doing in a mixing situation, right? I've got a compressor on the drum stem, and I'm using that to do drum compression. And then when it all sums, I'm using a compressor on the stereo sum, and then I'm doing that. And now we're in sort of a traditional stereo mastering situation. So again, there's no real right answer. It's what is my preference. My preference is to avoid 2 compression circuits active at the same time on a stereo bus. And my reason for that is the time constants won't align, and the song is always changing. That someone's hitting a crash cymbal all the time, and then they're not, and you're trying to find a way for these time constants to line up across 2 compressors. But as the song moves along, it's never really going to work. That's my experience. So I usually go with one that has a good general purpose across the tune. And also, I do automation in the analog domain all the time. It's called using my hands. So like when we hit the chorus, I'll move a time constant with my hands, and I'm doing this thing called automation, right? That works all the time. When I get to the chorus, and then when I'm back in the verse, I'll change the knobs again and automate it back to a different setting.
Oh, wow.
So that works all
analog.
the time.
Analog. Very,
it's old school. Remember in the 80s, man, when I was making metal records with Mark Sinisak, we're on a 24-channel board, and there's 3 guys at different parts of the mixing console, and you're responsible for moving these faders in this part of the song, and you're responsible for moving these faders in this part of the song, and we're one big automation machine. And so it's really no different than doing it and it's old school.
That's awesome. So another perennial question has popped up here in the live chat of where EQ then compression or then EQ. What's your thought process, and how do you establish which one's coming first in the chain?
Sure, sure. Well, it varies, and it varies by the track, and it varies on what do you want EQ to do. Let me just think of two examples. Okay, if I'm using parametric EQ, for instance, let me think of a situation here. Yeah, sure. Okay, so let's say I'm using a parametric EQ and I'm always using parametric to fix something. The times I'm boosting something in EQ is so rare, I'm using EQ to cut things so that I can make room for whatever else to open up. So I'm using a parametric EQ to cut, let's say, somewhere around 160, 200 to solve some kind of blooming frequency in the low mids, which is very common when you're raising gain. Excuse me. And let's say I do want to use the Vari-Mu compressor, for instance, right? So, well, I want to make this EQ change, but the Vari-Mu is going to smear everything out, because of its tubes, and it's got that kind of smearing tone to it. So, well, if I do the cut before the Vari-Mu, then things are still going to smear around. If I do the cut after the Vari-Mu, I might get a really much cleaner result that's going to, it's going to work for me. And I might be able to cut it deeper after the smear. I might cut it deeper before the smear, to kind of compensate for it. But where's it going to work? I'll try both, Also, again, from having done this for so long, you can kind of conceptualize what you're going to, it's like, well, I know if I do it this way, I'm going to get that. But I'll still move things around all the time to kind of, see what's going to happen. But there's a good example of using something. If, for instance, let's say I'm using the dangerous compressor, it doesn't matter if I put it before or after, because the thing's, it's very clean, it's very musical, it's very complimentary, but it doesn't have a smear, it doesn't have any EQ in it. It's really good. In that case, why would I put it before the dangerous compressor? Well, I would put it because I want to tuck something before the compression circuit kicks in. Because maybe if I tuck something down, it won't hit the compression circuit as much, and that's what I want.
Exactly.
So those are really good examples. With let's use the back EQ as another example. Again, like if I want to tame some bass, maybe I want to tame that bass before the compressor because I want to not have the circuit engaged so much. Or secondarily, I want the backs after the compressor because it's at the end of my signal chain and I want to use it to just way open up, starting at 18K. I do that all the time because the image gets so huge with the backs, using it at the end of the chain and then the end of the chain and then just opening it up. It's so awesome for that. I use it pretty much that way every day. But so
that's what it does best.
There's an example of an EQ being after a compressor. I need to buy another one because I need another one. I think you need, as a mastering engineer, you need two. You need one that just sits at the end of the chain and just does this all day long, and then you need another one before any compressors to like do the adjustments you want before the compression circuit. But I hope that answers your question. If you have follow-ups from this answer, let Ben know, and we'll stay on this for a minute.
Totally. So, another question came in here, and I remember this kind of coming up in the next video here, but let's talk about limiting real quick, because as I remember, you're limiting out of the box the limiter is in the box, right, before the stems go out to the tube bus, and then you do all of your processing, and then it comes back in. Now, are you also doing another limiter on the stereo return that comes in, or are you just doing the limiting before you go into the analog domain?
Yeah, great question. I do like pre-limiting because all transients will scale on the DA output. So you're going to raise transient levels going to analog. So you've just made your job harder. So let's compensate for that and do some pre-limiting. So that way, when the analog signal goes out, it rescales, but it rescales right back to where you had it. So you're not adding work to your plate. You're keeping the work where it's at. If you want to do more limiting, and I'll do this in stems, I want to do more limiting to kind of, now I'm creating an aggregate result. And again, we use this track in this video because it is such a big example of what we can do in stems. There's a lot of gain reduction. I saw a lot of flack on the Facebook post talking about this. And it's like, guys, we're solving a 15 dB gain situation here, and we're doing a great job of it.
Yeah.
So using that as an example, yes, I'm going to use limiting in the box for various stems to get us closer to that result, so that when it sums in stereo, I can do another stage of limiting, which is less. So we're stacking different stages of limiting along, and we're doing gentle stages as opposed to a blunt force stage. Because you can hear in those examples what the blunt force stage does. Yes,
Yeah.
your transients are all gone. They're all gone. But as far as final limiting, so let's come back to your question for a quick signal path.
Yeah.
I will use pre-limiting in a light way to do that compensation, so I'm not getting the rescaling effect to make my job harder. I'll do that all the time. If I need to use more limiting because I've got a really large dynamic range and I want to end up with a commercially pop level, I will do some pre-limiting before going out to analog and doing my final stage in the box, because digital limiters are faster. They are better at that task.
Yep.
I don't use input clipping unless the artist is requesting that sound. I think input clipping is cheap. It's a cheap way to get a result. I think it sounds like shit because it's just smearing distortion all over the place. And it's not limiting. It's called input clipping. It's called distorting the signal. It's not limiting. It's called input clipping. So if an artist really wants that sound, yes, I will do it. But if they're not asking for it, then I will not go in clipped, and I will do the final stage of limiting in the box. And one more positive gain out of not doing input clipping is, once it's there, you can't take it off. If you're not input clipping your signal, you always have room to do something. You can send it back out to analog for another pass, which I do all the time, and we can talk about that if you like. Or you can do, some kind of further process with a plugin in the box, and you're not fighting the input clipping that you just put on the signal. Because if you distort the signal on the way in, and then you do some kind of compression and limiting on that signal, you are raising the distortion that you just added. You can't take it away. So I don't know if that's discussed so much, but it's a very important thing to always remember, is that when you're distorting that thing on the way in, you can never take it off.
There's no way back after you clip.
No,
great. Well,
no way back.
So
you can do two prints. Yeah.
Yeah, you can do one with and without, which I think you mentioned you do that sometimes, right?
I do.
Nice. Well, so I think we've been talking a ton about the overall stem mastering process. This feels like a really good point to, instead of just talking about it, let's actually see how this works. Let's, cool. The third video in the series is where you actually take us through this whole stem mastering process on a song, so we can hear for ourselves what this difference is. And the biggest thing I definitely want people to know is there are level differences, and that's the whole point. This is mastering. The goal here is to go from a mix level up to a master level. So keep that in mind as you're watching this, and really try to pay more attention to the impact, the punch, the clarity of the mix, because that's, end of the day, that's really what your goal is and what you're pulling out of this mix. So yeah, let's check it out. This is gonna be fun.
Right on.
Mike Wells here, Stem Mastering Applied. We will break this segment into 3 components. 1, mix analysis. Here we will learn what we want to address and what we want to preserve. From there, we will go into the stems processing and tackle each stem, applying compression, limiting EQ where we need to arrive at our result of stereo processing. We will sum the stems together and process that stereo file to create our finished master. Let's jump into mix analysis. So the first thing I'm going to do, like any mastering engineer, is check out the mix. We have some notes from the producer. Let's give it a quick listen, and we'll talk about the feedback that we received.
Once upon a time, I met someone close to me, not someone I used to know.
Some things that we noticed right away: we have a very large dynamic range in this mix. They gave me a reference that they wanted me to consider as far as target loudness goes, which is very competitive. So right away, we know that there's a lot of heavy lifting that's going to be needed in the compression and limiting department to get this mix up to competitive standards. So what we're going to do now is just take a limiter, strap it across the mix, and crank it up to what we're going to need for commercial gain and see what happens.
Once upon a time, I met someone close to me, someone I used to know.
We noticed some things right away. A lot of distortion. Why? We're doing 13 dB of dynamic range reduction here. That is a profound amount of compression and limiting happening right there. Other things we notice right away are the low mids really start to crowd. They start to build up. We're also hearing complete loss of transient attack. The definition and the punch of the track has disappeared. What do we want to preserve? Well, the vocal is the main instrument. We also notice that the drums are very pronounced, but by smashing it, we really lose a lot of the power of the drums. Lastly, the instruments that are in the background, like the guitar and the bass, even with this heavy-handed limiting, they're staying put relative to everything else, and that's pretty cool. That's good to know. So the next thing I'm going to do is, guess what? Master the stereo mix. Why? By mastering the stereo mix first and going back to the client, the artist, the mixer, the producer, and getting everybody's approval with the stereo master, that provides the roadmap of what you're going to do with your stem decisions to not only meet what you've done in the stereo master, but completely beat it and deliver something far superior. So let's check out what I did with the stereo master. This was approved by the client and the producer and gave us the path on what to do with the stems.
Once upon a time, I met someone close to me, not someone I used to know.
This gives us a lot of great information. We have everybody on the same page on what the goal is. We understand where the top end is going to land. We have an idea of what compression is going to do and how we can improve upon that with the stem process. We've defined more in the low mids. We've created that polish on the top. This gives us the guidepost to move forward with stems and also a way to avoid jumping into a remixing situation. When I think about EQ changes in the stem process, we were talking about how much gain we needed to achieve here, right? So that's going to be a lot of compression, a lot of limiting. We can do that a number of ways. The way I like to think of it in the stem process is what I call making space. So we can use parametric EQ, shelving EQ, dynamic EQ, multiband compression, you name it. But the idea here is to look at where frequencies of different instruments are going to overlap. When you bring them up to commercial gain through the mastering process, you're making space for that primary instrument to stay primary instead of having everything compete for it as the mix comes up. So in this situation, we're looking at the drums. After I soloed everything, I found out that between 160 and 200, that's where the buildup is happening. It's in the ringing of the toms and the room sound of the drums. It's in a couple of notes in the bass guitar, and it's in a bit of the guitar overall with the reverb that's on the guitar. So we jump into the drums. I'm doing a bit of parametric EQ here, and I'm doing some compression and some limiting. And so what I want to play for you here is just the drum stem, and then the drum stem going through its stem processing as well. We'll go back and forth so you can hear each. We have reduced the dynamic range quite a bit, yet we're still maintaining a lot of snap. We have a lot more shine in the drum kit. We're bringing out more room sound because of the compression we're applying. We're compensating for that with some EQ as well to kind of keep it clean, and when the other instruments come in, as you'll hear with the finished master, they're not colliding in that low mid area. So that's what we're doing with the drums. Let's move on to the bass. When I took a look at the bass along with the other elements of the mix, I was noticing that between 160 and 200, that's where the frequency buildup is really happening. So I strapped a dynamic EQ around that, and that keeps those two notes in place. That allows the other instruments that share that primary space, in this case the vocal, to really shine, and the bass is no longer competing with it. Outside of that, bringing it out into the analog domain, giving it some really nice conversion, and a set of really great transformers really opened it up and made it pop. So check this out. First, you're going to hear the bass stem from the mix, and then you're going to hear the bass stem with the master processing on it. We're going to go back and forth here. A lot more clarity in the harmonics of the bass. It's richer, it's fuller, and certainly you can feel more width out of it as well. Let's move on to the guitars. The guitars sound great. They're not really getting in the way of anything. However, we get a little bit of puffing out and blooming around 300. So I've got a half a dB tuck around 300 at a parametric EQ, and again, out in the analog domain, going through a beautiful set of transformers. So you're really going to hear this baby open up. So let's do a little bit of back and forth here. You can hear the mixed stem and then the mastered stem, A lot more polish. Everything's very smooth. It really opens up and is really creamy and really makes the whole dreamy effect even more dreamy. The last element we have here as a stem is the vocal. The work we've done with the other stems has allowed us to really just let the vocal be the vocal. It's the primary instrument. It's the focus of the mix. We just get to let this guy come through. Not only do we get to let it come through, it's going through a tube compressor. It's handling its compression out there in the analog domain. It sounds beautiful. It's lush. It opens up. It's fantastic. Check this out. You're going to hear the vocal stem out of the mix, and then you're going to hear the vocal stem going through its.
Once upon a time, I met someone close to me, not someone I used to know.
Huge. All of that breath coming out. So much detail happening. Compressor's keeping it right in place, but with the EQ moves, the compression moves we've done to the other instruments and gain management, we can let the vocal be the vocal. It can be right there in the mix. Now let's sum all these guys together with our summing mixer and check out what we're going to do in the stereo domain. I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about what we're doing here in the analog domain again. And you're hearing the results, and you're hearing how huge, big, wide, spacious, deep everything is becoming. This is a testament to the conversion that you're using and being in the analog domain. We're choosing devices to make these decisions at the stem level so we can minimize what we're going to do when we go to stereo. Each stem receives its processing as we see fit, compression, limiting, EQ. All of the stems then arrive at the 2-bus plus, our summing mixer, sum them down to a stereo signal. And then where does it go from there? We pass it to my mastering console where I have my regular insert set up for stereo processing. If we take a step back and think about what I did to the stereo master to create our original master that got approved, I was doing dynamic EQ, multi-band compression, limiting, parametric EQ to get all that, right? Because we needed to solve all those issues to arrive at a good master. And it was a great master. What we're doing now at the stereo level is two things, the dangerous compressor and the dangerous backs EQ. The dangerous compressor is a great choice for this track in this context because now that I've done my work with stems, I want a light touch. It's got a great musicality, but it doesn't get in the way. The backs, all it does is shine. I always have it at the end of my signal chain. I'm going to play a couple files for you here. I'm going to start off with the stem master. I want you to hear how huge this thing is. I want you to hear how much we've achieved in this. And you're going to hear it when I switch back to the approved stereo master. You're going to hear how much goes away. And that's going to show you how much we were able to achieve. I'm going to start off with the stem master. I'm going to go to the approved stereo master. Back to the approved stem master.
Once upon a time, I met someone close to me, not someone I used to know. Yeah, someone close to me, not someone I used to know. Yeah.
Incredible stuff here. Listen to that image. Listen to that power, that punch, that definition, that clarity. It's huge. Think about where we started in the first video in this series, talking about what is stem mastering and why would you want to do it. You're hearing the why. You heard what we achieved by just slamming it up. You heard the challenges that we had to deal with. Now you're hearing the results and the power that this process can bring to a master. You can hear all these files at the Dangerous Music SoundCloud page. You can find a link to that page in the description of this video. I want to take a moment to thank Dangerous Music for making this video series possible and also for making the tools that make this process possible. Thank you to the band Hard Youth for making their track available, and thank you for watching.
Nice. So, Mike, that was a pretty epic explanation and kind of walkthrough of everything that goes into doing the stem mastering and getting to hear the before and after. And First question that always comes up whenever it comes to stem mastering, especially with these kinds of examples. We saw this in the live chat. I had this question I wanted to ask for myself as well. Louder is always better. So when you're in the mode of, you're in the business of making things louder, how do you not fool yourself into thinking, oh, well, this is 10 dB louder, of course it's better? How do you know it's actually also getting you all those other things to the sound that you want?
I guess the question I would ask back is to you, Ben, and maybe this is where you guys are all at, is louder is better, meaning, are you assuming that I'm listening to the mix and then listening to the master that much louder and comparing them at different levels?
Well, I mean, that's kind of, I mean, in the examples here, that's, when you go from the unprocessed to processed, there's that like 6 dB jump.
Oh,
is that what you're Is that what
sure.
you're hearing when you're doing it in real life as well?
I see. Well, for the purpose of the video, we're demonstrating, the differences.
Mm-hmm.
So as a working engineer, everything's gain matched. So, again, trying to convey these ideas in a 3-minute video, there's a lot of content going on there.
Mm-hmm.
So we do want to demonstrate the differences. And if you think about the end of the video 3, where we go back and forth between the stem master and the stereo master, those are gain matched.
Yeah.
So when we go from the crushed stereo mix to the stereo master, those are gain matched.
Mm-hmm.
When we're listening to the stems, the unprocessed stem versus the processed stem, yes, those are at different levels.
Yeah.
And the idea there is to show how much difference we're getting at the stem level.
And so in a typical working day, you're not necessarily doing that comparison, are you? You're mainly going between that finished master, or the stereo master and the stem master, to make sure, am I nailing it? Am I getting what I want difference wise? It's kind of similar to, like, do you mix in solo or do you mix with all the faders up? Of course you listen, and if you're going to mix in solo, your kick drum's going to sound incredible until you turn everything else on and all of a sudden it's 10 dB too loud or something,
Right. No, everything's got to be gain matched, or what the hell are you listening to? Yeah.
So do you have targets? Do you kind of have like target ranges on a couple of things here? One, when it comes to compression, do you have an amount? Kind of like, this is, I'll only do 4 dB of compression and never any more, or do you kind of always leave that up for grabs?
Yeah, it's all situation based. I can say I go by ear more than I go by any kind of number. If I feel like it's getting small and it's losing the intent of what was going on, then I'll try to find another way. Maybe I crush it and then push it back in parallel so I can get what I want, RMS wise. But it's once so I'm going back and forth all the time, and I have to go back and forth gain matched again, or it's just, what are you doing? You're flying blind unless you're always comparing it against what you have. And if I'm hearing everything sit underneath a compressor, then something needs to change. So I'm not really concerned with a number. I'm concerned more with how it sounds.
Yeah. And I think that's the answer I was looking for. Like, that's, so many people, like, that's kind of what they're looking for, right? The questions I'm always seeing are like, how much of a boost should I make here? How much should I cut here? How much compression should I be using? This is music. This is art. It's like, how do you paint a painting? You use a brush.
Yeah.
No one's telling you like how much red to use or how much green to use. You got to use what feels right to you, and it's the same thing for compression for EQ. Use your ears and know what effect the compressors are having and what effect the EQs are having. If it's, and like you mentioned, if it's starting to get small, you might be over compressing it. If it's but if you open up the attack, maybe you'll get back that transient that you want, but with the crunch. And this is why, like, having parallel processing, like you mentioned, is so important, because that allows you to blend these colors and do more. But again, on kind of aiming for a target, when it comes to loudness, what are you typically looking for like a dynamic range on most of your masters?
Do you mean coming in as mix or results?
Uh, let's do both, but what I'm really concerned about is the result.
Results.
Yeah, what's that target looking like?
Sure. Well, it certainly varies. Songs, I wouldn't say song to song.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a record, then it's kind of relative, within the record. And but the artist really dictates what the target is. And the reason I state that is loudness, the numbers don't make sense. That's a better answer for you. For instance,
Yeah.
I could have a track that I did yesterday for this singer-songwriter, and it's her with a piano and she's singing over it. You know what? And it's from 0 dBFS down to -9 or -10, RMS, right? And it sounds twice as loud as I Got the Keys from Jay-Z, which is at -3.
Yeah.
And why does it sound louder? Because there's two instruments going on and the speaker gets to move.
Mm-hmm.
But I have hip hop guys that, because that is the loudest song of this year, they want their record to be that loud. So I have some conscious hip hop guys that could care less about the loudness target. They're more interested in the feel of the song. So it really varies artist to artist. And I go in and out of being very insistent on references, not so much for EQ, but for loudness. And it's like a fluctuating thing. It kind of depends on what's been happening in the last month, but like how much drama around loudness have I experienced in the last month will dictate on how insistent I am on having references. But it is such a unique target for every artist. There is a lot of emotion around loudness. And let's all be clear on one thing. This is how I describe loudness. And this is after when I was an artist and making my own records, and I was very concerned with how loud my record was stacked up to someone else's record. Because as an artist, you don't know. You're just comparing your record to other people's records. And
Yeah.
loud is a competitive benchmark. It's a competitive data point. And if my record's not as loud as another record, then I feel bad. What is that? That's self-esteem. That's what it is. It's insecurity. Loudness is a measure of self-esteem. It is not a measure of the quality of audio.
Yes.
It is a measure of self-esteem. And whose self-esteem is it? The artists. The artists that don't care about loudness, to me, are not worried about playing in that pissing pool. The artists that come to me and are just adamant about loudness are very concerned about how they are viewed inside that pissing pool. So it really has nothing to do with the number. It comes down to what the goal is of the artist. And also, as I mentioned earlier, you can have a very simple arrangement with 1 or 3 instruments, and it's going to sound 4 times as loud as something with a gigantic, sub bass, because the sub bass takes up so much energy of the signal and takes up so much demand for the driver that in order to get it as loud as something else, you do have to compress it to the limit of physics, which is 3 decibels.
Yeah. Well, and that's, you hit on it right there, man. It's the loudness is obviously always relative, and it's also, we're overall in the universe of music and music playback, we're getting to the point where it's starting to not matter. Spotify, YouTube, Apple Music, they're starting to give us a more level playing field that, if you go to -3, you're going to get turned down 3 to 6 dB, and so your overall apparent volume ends up being the same as that singer-songwriter, but you're missing out on 9 dB of transients that you could have had your kick hitting harder, which is kind of backwards from generally what most of these guys want. They want their stuff to hit hard, but they want it to be like a pancake, which doesn't compute, right?
Yeah. Well, we're in a very interesting place right now with loudness. We're getting closer to the tipping point, and we don't see the tipping point yet, but we're getting closer. And this is my take on it. So take it as you please. But here's my take on it, and that is, yes, all of the streaming services gain normalized to a RMS. They don't gain normalized to a peak, right? So, but the best thing about standards is there's so many to choose from. So every streaming service has their own. They have their own standard. Apple, I think, is -16. Spotify is -14. et cetera, et cetera. They're all different, levels. However, if you want to, hit in the middle, let's say you want to hit in 14, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a great middle ground because someone's going to turn you down, but pretty much 14 is a safe bet, right? So these benchmarks of dynamics that we're seeing in streaming, they present the opportunity for dynamic range. Now and so here's where I'm driving at. We're getting close to the tipping point. Why are we not there yet? Because we still live in the land of self-esteem. And what I mean by that is, yes, we can create masters that have a really beautiful sense of dynamic range. 14, we can have that 14 dB scale of dynamics. And man, would that be awesome. We could all work against this level of minus 14, as our average level. That would really be amazing. Here's where it breaks down. You can have everyone agreeing to this, and then they're going to take an MP3 that's a reference that you just gave them, and they're going to compare that MP3 to other things. And that's when this whole argument falls apart. So what I see as the tipping point where we're going to get on the other side of this phenomenon is when the devices that we all use to listen to music all gain normalized to some level.
Yeah.
When your phone, when your car, when your iPod dock, when every device that you're using has some kind of, dial norm, for lack of a better term, then we are on the other side of this coin. It's having that system in place to get us to the other side. Apple having sound check is still not going to be in our favor. Microsoft having their version of it, I forget what it's called, is still not working in our favor. The tech companies need to step away from their loudness solution. We have a solution. It's, in the old world of radio, it's called dial norm, right? We have that solution. That's what streaming is doing. They're doing a form of dial norm. When the hardware manufacturers and the software manufacturers all agree to play in this pool, we will be on the other side of this coin. I think it'll take a while. Once everyone's doing it, it'll still take a while because there's going to be old tech, like old technology that still does it the old way. So we're going to have to slowly phase this stuff out. How I'm trying to address it right now is to create two masters. And that is its own very interesting psychological phenomenon, because you explain it to the artist and they like the idea. They don't really understand the idea, but they're believing you because you're the mastering engineer. And they're putting faith in you because of what you do and the knowledge you bring to the table. So you're saying, I will provide this, this second master that's going to sound better on Spotify. And you know what? That doesn't work. And it doesn't work because it is a very different master. Because, let's talk about, we're reducing transients, right? But we're also changing the way the RMS is perceived relative to those transients. So the background information, the ambience, the reverbs, all that stuff, it does change. Yeah. And so it's not as simple as just, backing off a limiter. It doesn't work that way. So I'm trying to look at another way to kind of address this as we're moving through this middle ground. The way I'm looking at it is, and this is actually funny because it actually speaks to the STEM process, but the way I'm trying to look at it now, and I'm playing around with this with a few artists that are willing to play with me, and that is, how can we preserve transients on drums? Because that's where the impact is, right? The kick, the snare, the things that are fast and the things that snap out, and 99% of the time, that's the drums. For electronic music, for production music, that can be effects, like explosions or, that kind of stuff, something that's fast. So with a stem mastering situation, we can massage the drum stem to still maintain a sense of transience and still get the buildup, that we'll have when we have the, the modern loudness master, for lack of a better term, the competitive master. And that way, the meat of the song stays the same. The only thing that's different is this transience, right? Yeah. And that way, when it goes to Spotify, it sounds the same. The difference is you can now feel it. And so I'm approaching that as like, can we see that as an intermediary solution while we're going towards the other side of this coin? Because once we're on the other side, the ball changes completely. But we're not there yet, and I think we're a ways away from it still. Maybe, I mean, technology changes fast. I want to say 10 years. Maybe that's too long because of the rate of change, based on technological input. But this is something for everybody to consider. But because I can say from direct experience, let's make two masters. It's not working. It's not working. I wish it worked. But again, you're almost giving them two different things to approve. And they want to approve the thing that gives them the high level of self-esteem. And that's the crushed competitive loud stereo master. If they now have to approve something that isn't loud, it's not working for them. So, this other idea of how can we just maintain a sense of punch through our transients and keep the rest of it the same, that is sort of a middle ground. And it's playing out very interestingly with the guys that are working with me on it.
Totally. And I mean, and like you mentioned there, it's the taste. What people have been hearing is 128 MP3s with 5 dB or less of, crest on them. So we've gotten used to that sound, and especially in electronic music, like you give them that dynamic mix, and they're like, this doesn't sound good. Like even gain matched and everything is leveled out. They enjoy that there. So I think you're right that it's technology, and then it's also aesthetics and taste from the producers, from the audience, also catching up to enjoy dynamics and having more depth sonically to what they're listening to. So this brings up I had another really good question. I saw it on the chat, and I also thought about this too when I was watching the videos. You talk very lovingly about your transformers. So a couple questions are, what transformers do you really like? But more importantly, how do you develop a taste for transformers? Because a lot of people, especially when they're starting out, they don't necessarily, they put transformers and analog and tube, and they just kind of do, and they hear it's doing something, but really, can you help point people in the right direction for what they should be listening for when it comes to tubes and transformers, and developing taste so they can start picking out, I want to use the API for this one, the Neve for this one, and vice versa?
Yeah, sure. No, it's a great question. I certainly had to learn all that stuff myself. Okay, well, let's divide that into tubes, and let's even put tape in there, right? So we've got tubes and tape, we've got transformers, and we've got, let's call it boxes with character. How's that? Because you mentioned the API 2500. And tubes, tape, transformers, and boxes with character. Let's talk about tubes. Tubes, again, there's different ways to drive a tube. So there is no all tubes sound this way, but it is common and typical, I would say, more often than not, that a tube device is going to smush things up and it will slow things down. Meaning, if you've got a really hard, fast, hitting 909 or clicky kind of thing going on, and you're putting it through a tube box, it's going to slow it down. It's going to mush that up a touch. For instance, I'll have rap guys come in and they think they want to go to tubes and they think they want to go to analog tape because that analog stuff is going to make it happen. Those are the two worst decisions they could make. Going to the Guerrero and then hitting a tape machine. Oh, that is the wrong choice, man. But they're looking at it from what they're reading on the internet, man. Oh, analog, tubes. Oh, analog tape. Yeah, man, it's fat. And it is fat, but not for your genre. And so tubes typically will slow things down. It'll slow down the transients. It'll fuzz things out. So it's, and by fuzz, I mean you get a touch of harmonic distortion, from the tube. How much signal you put into the tube device will also dictate how the output's going to sound. So if you get your hands on a tube box, play around with how much level goes into it. Some of them have input gain control, some of them don't. So, play around on how it sounds when you drive it differently. Listen to how it spreads out. The Tube Tech boxes have a very different tube flavor than the Manley tube boxes. And even within the Manley family, I find that the Varimu versus the Massive Passive have very different sounds. And then even within the Massive Passive, you can drive it balanced or unbalanced, and you can bypass, one of the transformer stages. I believe it's the input stage. So I don't have a massive passive, and but I've played around with it, and I kind of, I've certainly heard it. But the Very has a very distinctive character, and it does slow things down. It does spread things out. It does fuzz up, the lower mids. So I think if you want to take a common takeaway from this about a tube box, the common takeaway is it's going to fuzz things up a bit. So it's going to spread things around. You might have to use EQ to kind of tuck that back in, because maybe it's going to bloom some low mid frequencies out, which is common. It's going to slow some of your transients down. So if you're doing EDM or really hard hitting, rap, probably not a good choice. If you're in a stem situation and you want to use it on a vocal, probably a great choice, So those are some common guidelines for tubes. I certainly know there are guys that drive the tube differently and say it doesn't suffer from the softening of the transients effect. I haven't heard any of those boxes. They're modern claims. Let's move over to transformers real quick. So a transformer is, it certainly wasn't designed for character. It was designed for function, right? To balance the signal. Now, what's cool about them is, again, how you put the signal into them dictates what sound is going to come out of them. The sound is going to be harmonic distortion again, and it can be a compressor as well as a harmonics device. How hard you drive it will dictate how much of the signal it will soak up, and how much you drive it will also dictate how much harmonic spread you will get out of it. So one of the downsides of modern boxes is, and one of my friends, Ian over at Capital Mastering, he has the Magic Death Eye company, and he hand winds his own transformers. And a big part of his box is the claim of the transformer that he makes, because they are hand wound, and the amount of time he's taken to build that particular transformer. The point that he's speaking to is not all boxes are, you can't drive their transformer for a sound. That's not part of the function. Just because it has a transformer doesn't mean that that is a color sound that you're going to get out of it. Yeah. So, this API 550M that I have is a custom box. They didn't make many of them. And so the transformers are custom within them. I've got an old pair of Neumann PEA EQs, which are from the Neumann VMS 70 cutting lathe. And those transformers from Halfa actually turned out to be one of those old hand-wound World War II kind of deals with a bunch of women in a factory winding them up by hand, and it was before they were doing them in an automated way. So the automated way of making a transformer industrially through a manufacturing plant, they're made for efficiency, and efficiency means low distortion, low noise. So what are you not going to get out of it? Harmonics and saturation. They weren't designed that way. They're designed for performance. They're not designed for impurities. The impurities are where you get the sound out of them. So if you're looking out on the internet and everyone's saying, ooh, wow, I love the API 5500 for its transformers. Well, actually, no, you don't, because it's a very modern transformer that's not built for that purpose. Maybe you think you're hearing something, but you're probably not. So if you want to think about that as a concept, try to do more research into what that transformer really is. Just the off-the-shelf ones that are modern, they're not built for sound, they're built for purpose. And purpose is low noise, low distortion. And if you want to look at something old that has, that was a hand wound situation or a custom situation, maybe listen to them first and drive them in a different way and see how they sound. The more you saturate them, the more they will have a compression effect. However, the more you saturate them, the more like a tube, they will slow down your transients. So they have a plus and a minus, and it's kind of, again, it's never a one size fits all. In this example, for the guitars, I'm driving them in a certain way, and I'm getting the harmonic spread. And since the guitars are soft, I'm not dealing with the loss of transient speed. But if I had it across the mix, it wouldn't work because there's really snappy drums on this mix. You will get a 3 dB bump just by using a transformer on a lot of boxes, so don't let that fool you. Again, like you were saying, Ben, just because it got louder doesn't mean it's better, but you'll get fooled by it. So it's another thing to be careful of. If we step into the world of tape, again, it's a compressor, it's an EQ, it's a harmonic enhancer. The formula that you use, of tape can impact, the harmonic spread and the type of compression you're going to get based on how hard you're going to hit it. The overbias that you use is going to certainly impact the harmonics. The calibration of the machine will impact the harmonics. when Mike Spitz was still with us, this machine sitting behind me, this guy, that's a custom machine from Mike Spitz. We spent half a year specking it out, and it took him a year to build it. This machine just turned 13 last year, so she's turning 14 in a few months. That is that was built from scratch, repurposing, and a lot of it's been highly customized. But you can still get, refurbed machines and everything, but these kind of highly built purpose, kind of situations, Mike was the man, and it's sad that we lost him, but, it happens to us all. And the reason I bring that up is I was very fortunate in getting to know Mike and really spend a lot of time with him. And he many times sat me down and he would say, Bob Ludwig showed me this trick that he likes to use with tape all the time, and George Marino showed me these tricks that he liked to use all the time. So, it was really cool. I've got this notebook of tricks from Mike Spitz on how to drive a tape machine from other mastering engineers. And that's pretty cool stuff. But,
wow.
But the thing about tape is, it is going to soften the transients, period. So you just need to be aware of that. It is going to do it. And you drive it harder, it's going to soften them up even more. So, and the distortion you get from tape may or may not be a good thing, just like transformers, just like tubes. So in all of these situations, we're talking about distortion, we're talking about an alteration of the transient, we're talking about a harmonic spread. So they're all cool and they're all dangerous all at the same time, because you can overuse them in an instant way. I mean, you were talking about louder is better, right? And the fooling yourself concept. Man, harmonic distortion is exactly the same way. Fuck, that sounds amazing. And tomorrow you're like, what the hell was I thinking? So a little goes a long way, man. In the Dangerous 2-Bus Plus, they've got a transformer feature on there, and it's really cool. It's a purpose-built transformer for harmonic, distortion and the way you drive it, like a compressor and a harmonic device. So, and that one, a little goes a long way on that one, man. I know it goes from 0 to 10, but I rarely have it above, around the 10 o'clock position, because I'm getting the mojo that I want out of it with just a little. Lastly, boxes with character, right? So if I look here real quick, I've got the Allen Smart C2, right? That is a great equalizer. It also has a function called compression on it, right? But it's really a great EQ. The API 2500, that's another cool EQ, man. And it also has this compression circuit into it. So the thing to remember about boxes with character is that you can't take it off. I had a group of a guy, a young mixer that I work with a lot, asked me about, he's an EDM guy and he wanted to buy a Varimu. And I was like, you don't want to buy a Varimu. No. And he was sold on it. And so I said, why don't you come into the studio and you can listen to all my compressors, bring everything. I've got a bunch behind me too, right? I said, just bring some songs and I'll just let you sit here and I'll hook them all up in series and you can just play around with all of them. And so that turned into, can I bring some friends, which turned into, I've got 8, young engineers in here that all brought reference material. And we spent the whole night. It was a blast, but watching these guys hear all these boxes was actually very fun for me, because you're watching a lot of light bulbs go off. But at the end of the day, here's the interesting thing about this whole exercise, because I'm telling them they wanted one compressor that they would have available in the analog domain to kind of send things out and send things back in. They're looking for maximum flexibility across different genres. They're looking for, like lots of features to handle different types of situations. And, because they don't have a lot of money and they want to build their analog rig slowly, just like I did, man. And so I know this is going to sound like a hard sell, and it's not, because what it speaks to is the quality of the device. Every single one of these guys, what's the compressor they were going to go buy? The Dangerous compressor. You know why? Because it has more features than the other guys do, and it's not a box of character, but it's also not a Stark box. I have a GML 2030 Stark. It's called the Navy SEALs of compressors, right? I mean, you can do anything with this thing, but it's Stark and it's clinical. It's functional, but it doesn't have any kind of pleasing ability to it. The Dangerous compressor has some cool musicality to it, but no EQ. And it's got the bass cut, it's got the sibilance boost, it's got the smart dynamics. I know I sound like a commercial. I know I sound like I'm trying to sell it, but I'm not. The thing is really cool. And if you're looking for your first compressor, it's a great choice, man. All the 8 guys walked out of here and said, wow, dude, that's the one I want to buy. There you go.
I mean, that's a big thing.
So that's all those 4 topics. Yeah.
Well, that's really cool to hear, though, too. You literally answered one of my questions, which was going to be, where should people be starting? And it's interesting that you mentioned the dangerous compressor, because it is, we're not here trying to make everybody buy the same compressor, but go listen to a bunch of stuff and judge for yourself. Number two, buying something that's flexible and gets you the sound that you want isn't necessarily the one that has the most tubes or transformers or color in it, because then you're constantly coloring with the same thing. It's like, do you want to always be painting with the color red, or do you also want some greens and blues?
Right.
And this is what I thought was really interesting about your videos as well, is the mixture of clean and color. So knowing where you want what. So, on the conversion you want clean, and then you get into a 2-bus, and like you mentioned, on the 2-bus plus, it's super clean, super transparent. And then it's got 3 functions in there that let you do not that, which is, it's about having control and taste over all of this coloring in that you're doing.
Right. It's fun. And I also have to say, if you're out of the box, and I mean, this is going to sound like a sell because I'm not messing around with this, man. This Bax is the coolest EQ I've ever bought. It is. It's the most versatile EQ I've ever bought. I use it on everything. It's just, you guys, if you haven't heard one, hear one. Like I said, I'm buying a second one. It's that good. So I mean, if you're going to build like an analog rig and get out of the box and you want a compressor EQ, take a look at that combination, man. I can't tell you how much flexibility is in those 2 boxes. I use them both every day. So those are the most common devices. Yeah.
We had a question came in. They were wondering what that box on your desk with the big M is. Can you talk about that piece?
Which one? I got 2 of them.
You got 2 of them. What are those? Are those custom pieces?
Let's see. There's this one. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think that one. Yeah.
And then there's this one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this one is a limiter that I built, and this is a spectral equalizer, I call it, that I built. And there really isn't anything on the market that did what I wanted in those 2 functions. So I worked with a guy here in LA who builds black boxes, as he says, and we spent some time designing them, and he built them for me. Yes.
Nice. I had a question come in about the Bax EQ specifically. How you say it's the most versatile EQ, but intuitively, it's a high shelf, low shelf, high pass, low pass. How is that versatile if it doesn't have any parametric bands or any other sort of functions to it?
Sure, great question, actually. Well, with any EQ, you're going to introduce phase, phase shifts, right? So unless you're using a linear phase EQ in the box, but parametric can actually do a lot more damage than good across a stereo mix. So I think we've been sold a bag of goods about parametric EQ, and it's one of those things that the deeper you get into mastering, the more you want to stay away from it. You use it when you really need to use it, but if you can stay away from it, your results are better, in my opinion. Your image will stay better, and your punch will stay better. It's one of those sugar boxes, and I have a GML 9500, and again, talk about transparency, transparent, but also talk about dangerous, get yourself into trouble. You can get yourself into trouble. Boosting with a parametric, I really think that's a dangerous way to go. I was told a philosophy a long time ago by a mentor of mine that said, you want to start figuring out what to take away before you want to, start adding things. And the reason I think that's a good philosophy is, especially in mastering, is you're going to be making everything louder, right? Meaning more compressed. So you're reducing the dynamic range. You're not really making anything louder. But in reducing the dynamic range in order to do gain makeup, which makes it louder, if you're taking something away, what you're doing is allowing other things to come up when you do the gain makeup. And that actually gives you a lot better results than trying to push something up. I will say there's an exception to the rule, and that's using the 18K filter on the backs and opening it up. But, and again, that goes back to there's no rules, right? So, but coming back to your question of, it seems like a very simple box. How is there a lot of flexibility? Well, the 2 functions interact with each other. And then when you have all 4 of them interacting, you can end up with a lot of different shaping curves. So a back sandal curve is not a shelf. It's not a fixed thing. It is a sweeping thing. And then if you interact, the cut filters with it, you can end up with bells. So you can end up with sort of a parametric situation, not with a tight cue, but you can end up with like a tonal shaping situation. So don't think of it as this and this. Think of it as this, or it's really narrow or it's very wide. And then when you get the bass and the high end frequencies working together and with the shelves, you can create some really interesting curves. Take one and, run a white noise through it and run that into an analyzer. You should do this with any EQ so you can understand what the controls are doing. Shoot white noise through it, start moving the controls and see how the white noise reacts. That's where you're seeing how the thing actually works. So if you see how it works here with your eyes, then when you're listening to it, you can consider how it's working with your ears. Those are, two functions of your brain that are working together very well. So again, I'm giving you my philosophy. You don't have to listen to what I'm saying. But in my philosophy, if you can avoid parametric EQ and get away with like a shelving or a back sandal situation where you're compensating for things, especially cutting it and letting the other stuff come up instead of boosting things. And I'm talking about mastering again, not talking about, mixing, and it's a totally different ball game.
Yep.
So in mastering, if you in general can take things away and let other things open up, I think you'll have the image. You'll notice the image is bigger. You'll notice the punch is better, and your phase artifacts are far less.
I mean, you brought up such a good point there too. Of especially with analog gear, like we get so spoiled in the box of seeing the lines and being like, oh, what you see is what you get. You got to really not true a lot of times. Like even when it's a digital EQ. It may look like this, but it might be actually delivering something slightly different. But most importantly is on analog gear. Like I remember the first time I did exactly what you said of white noise through a Pultec EQ and learning that, like these frequency numbers on here, they're somewhere near there, but it's not actually 30 or 60. It's like, maybe it's 36 and like 62, and it changes from unit to unit. So being able to learn your pieces of gear and learn that, what's happening isn't always perfectly correct. It frees you up to be like, that helped me a lot to no longer care like being precise and being like, I'm going to do +1 on my Pultec. And if I do +2, it's too much. You're just like, cool. Oh, I like how it sounds there. And now we're good to go. But learning your gear and learning what you like, learning your taste, trying things out and trying them, not necessarily while you're in the middle of working on something. This was a tip I picked up from Luca when we worked with him down in Las Vegas. He takes days where he has his working sessions where he's working. He uses the tools and the setups that he knows. But then he'll take a day and try things. Just open it up and having fun and just using his ear to see like, let me test drive this new piece of gear, or let me try this new plugin and see if I like it, see how it works, see if, I can picture myself using this on my work moving forward. Giving yourself that time to experiment and to try new things is so important.
Have your friends over.
It helped a lot too, right? Yeah.
Do the same thing with your friends over. Yeah.
Yeah, so you can learn together. And actually, we had a good question come in on the chat here of is Federico, where he's asking, how do you compare A to Ds and D to As? Because he can hear the difference that transistors and tubes and transformers are making, but then when he listens to converters, he's having trouble noticing the difference between different converters. So I know you've got a lot of experience with this, Mike. What are you hearing and what are you looking for when you're comparing converters?
That's a great question. And, I want to add to your question, I want to add dither to that. So let's take them together. I don't think people realize how much of a difference dither makes. So how would you analyze converters? AD is a lot easier to analyze because AD, you just capture it, you stack them up, and then you listen to them, right? And it doesn't matter what DA you're listening to because you're hearing the differences of that AD converter, one against the next. But listening to multiple DAs, um, one way to do it is to have a multiple input stage. Like, I mean, you can put it through a mixing console and, you know, mute and solo different channels, and you've got the same signal going through different converters. And that way you can hear each one of them. How I've done it in the past is I'll do them two at a time, because the dangerous master has two inputs, and I can just go in and out between the two inputs. And I'll say, like, okay, I like this one better. And then I'll put the other one in there and I'll listen to that one. Okay, do I like this one better? And so you can kind of process of elimination go to the ones that the one that you like at the end of the day. And like I said, AD is a lot easier. Just push the signal in, record it, and then listen to them all off of the same DA converter, and you'll know which one you like. The thing about DA converters is, interestingly enough, I think it's interesting that converters now have processing tools on them. So
yeah,
I've seen a couple that have like distortion functions on the AD stage. It's like, wow, input clipping's not bad enough. We got to distort before we input clip. All right. So my 2 cents is to stay clear of converters that have color functions on them. That's my 2 cents. Your mileage may vary. Maybe you have a different experience, and I'm not telling you that you're wrong. But for me, I want the converter to give the DA converter without question, both of them. But, we're going out to analog. You want to get the most bang for your buck in the analog domain. So as far as what to listen for the width, listen for the height, listen for the depth. The width is going to be the easiest thing for you to hear. I think height, until you get familiar with what that is harder to hear. Width is going to be easiest. Depth is going to be second. Height's going to be the third thing as far as like what you're going to hear, from learning how to hear that stuff. But just go between two converters, and just keep listening to them back and forth. Listen for the width. Listen, to the height. As far as like what kind of music to play, don't play something that's going to beat the living shit out of your ears, man, because you're just not going to be able to focus on the converter. Listen to like a solo piano, listen to something and the reason I say piano is one of the most complex instruments that we've ever come up with as human beings. The overtone series, the harmonics, the dynamic range. I don't care if you don't like solo piano, but use it for this purpose, because then you're using something to get some education out of it. So don't get something that, don't get like the Yngwie Malmsteen of piano. You don't need something like that. Just get someone that's, playing something slow, something that has a lot of, space around it. Because the more space and ambience that you can hear in the recording that you're playing back, the easier you're going to be able to hear the converter. So use something simple like a solo piano that's not playing really fast. Maybe they're holding sustaining notes on the pedal. That's going to be great stuff. Something like a simple classical piece, not Baroque, not not interpretive, just something simple, man. Get some Bach in there. That dude was very simple, right? And listen for those things one at a time. Just keep listening. Bring your friends, man. I think different people will help you learn this stuff easier than you trying to learn it on your own. And find a good room that you can listen to this in. And that's how I would go about converters. Because once you have an idea of the DA, just, push this stuff into ADs and listen to the playback of the ADs, and then you'll know what the ADs sound like, because once you've gotten familiar with the DA converter, then you can start measuring the AD converters.
So one piece at a time.
And exactly. So let me say that's converters. Let me move over to dither real quick. I had a group of kids here talking about dither, and it was interesting. Once one of them grasped it, it seemed like other guys started to grasp it. But we've all heard over the last, 15, 20 years, mastering engineers saying that dither really matters. And you know what? It really matters. And again, here's what I would recommend doing. Get familiar with your DA converter. Get really familiar with your DA converter. And then get your hands on a bunch of dither algorithms. Like, Weiss Engineering, Daniel Weiss out in Switzerland. He makes 3. There's Power 1, there's Power 2, and there's Power 3, right? They all sound completely different. There's the mbit plus algorithm from Isotope. There's the IDR dither from Waves, and there's Sonorous. That guy from Sonorous now has his own dither algorithm. Every single one of these guys sounds totally different. The EQ changes. Some of them have an MS function going on, so like the image changes, and you'd be astonished how much of a difference that can make in your choice of how the master is going to sound. I had a chat with Daniel Weiss one time, and I said, so which algorithm do you prefer? And he said, well, which one do you prefer? And I said, well, I really like Power 2 on like rock and hip hop, but I really like Power 3 on like Americana and folk music. And I said, so what do you think of that result? And he said, your feelings are consistent with many others. So, Daniel Weiss, ladies and gentlemen,
Yes.
maker of Weiss Engineering. I love the limiter, and I love his dither algorithm. He makes a dedicated file conversion, sample rate conversion dither product called Sericon. It's a great product if you want to take a look at it. None of his stuff is cheap, but if you want to get into mastering and you want to play with the big boys, it's something worth looking at. But Mbit Plus from Isotope. No offense to Isotope, I'm really not a fan. I haven't found any situations where I really like it. IDR from Waves. If you're doing really aggressive hip hop, I have found times, gangster rap. I have found times where IDR sounds really good because it's cold and it's hard.
Yeah.
But the Weiss Engineering power stuff I really like. And Power 3 to me sounds wider and softer, modifies the bass. Power 2 to me is it's better for really slammed rock music and hip hop. And Power 1 has a different EQ than Power 2, otherwise it's the same. So once you're familiar with your DA converter and you really know what to listen for in your DA converter, take the same file in different genres and put out different dithers of those genres and listen to them. And you're going to be surprised at what a difference it makes. And once you get your head wrapped around that, again, everything we've been saying today comes down to your knowledge of your tools and you putting together in your head, I'm going to try this first. And the more you have under your belt of that mental signal path, if you will, when you're going places, you're going to be like, I'm going to try this first. But as recent as yesterday, I'm working on this Americana record, and I was certain that Power 3 was going to be the place for her because that's usually what works for me. Power 2 won, so you'd be surprised.
Have to always be listening and always, not assuming that just what worked on this record is going to work on that record. Always being open to, that's really cool. Well, Mike, we're closing in, man. This is almost 2 hours already.
Okay.
We could do questions and talk about this stuff all day long, but I think
For sure.
To kind of wrap this up, a couple things for everybody out there. One, I posted a link to a survey that we'd love you guys to fill out. Just let us know what you thought of today's broadcast and what we're doing with these live streams in general. Number two is we have a Facebook group, the Puremixers group. So if you guys want to keep this conversation about STEM mastering going, let's head over there. It's a little bit friendlier, or sorry, not a little bit, a lot friendlier of a place than the Pensados group. Just saying, we keep it really fun in there, and it's all focused on learning and sharing with each other. So head over to the Puremixers group, and we'll keep. You guys can ask Mike more questions, interact with him directly over there. And then I definitely want to give a big shout out to Dangerous Music for not only sponsoring Mike's videos, but also this broadcast and making awesome gear that we all use every day. Again, we're not paid to say this. We actually use this gear day in, day out because it's the gear that lets us do what we like to do. So big shout out to them, to Sweetwater as well for helping out with this broadcast. And again, we hope you guys really enjoyed this. Let us know how you felt through the survey. And Mike, I'll let you have the final word, man. Anything else you want to share with all the watchers out there?
Sure. Well, first and foremost, Ben, thanks for having me on this, man. It's really an honor to be part of the Puremix family here for this, so thank you. And thanks for everyone listening and tuning in. I hope this was, valuable information for you. I certainly had a lot of fun, and I hope it was good for you too. So thanks.
Yeah. Awesome.
I will join the Facebook group, and I'll be happy to answer any questions anyone has as far as me being able to help.
Killer, man. Well, Mike, dude, thank you so much for taking a couple hours out today and discussing this and sharing your ideas on STEM mastering and also breaking that whole process down so that people can, use these techniques, use these ideas, and integrate that into their own workflows. So yeah, guys, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you back here no later than very soon. All right.